"Call whoever you want," the manager mocked, laughing in front of everyone in the meeting room. The man simply picked up the phone and made a silent call that no one took seriously. Minutes later, the phone rang, and the manager's face lost all color in front of everyone. If this beautiful story of overcoming and love interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching us from. Continuing. The morning in Manhattan began like any other, with the chaotic traffic of Park Avenue, the hurried back and forth of people, and the grey sky that seemed to reflect the heavy routine of those living in the country's largest metropolis. On the 23rd floor of a modern corporate building, made of mirrored glass and chilled by icy air conditioning, the Atlantic Investment and Management Group was preparing for another Monday filled with meetings, goals, and pressure. Mark Sterling adjusted the knot of his navy blue tie as he watched the city below through the reception window. At 37, he carried a serene posture that contrasted with the agitation of the environment around him. His brown hair was slightly graying at the temples, his gaze was attentive, and he possessed a calmness that few could maintain in that frenetic rhythm. There was something about him that drew attention, but not in an obvious way. He was the kind of man who went unnoticed when he wanted to, but when he spoke, he made everyone stop and listen. That morning, however, Mark was not there as he usually was in other companies. His presence had a specific purpose, an objective that only he and a small group of people knew. For the last 3 weeks, he had infiltrated the company as a simple temporary financial analyst, hired to assist in the closing of quarterly balance sheets. No one suspected, no one questioned. He was just another new face among so many others who entered and left that place. But Mark was no ordinary analyst. A graduate in business administration from Columbia University, with a specialization in forensic auditing, he worked discreetly for a consultancy specialized in corporate investigations. His work was delicate, silent, and often thankless. He entered companies where there were suspicions of irregularities, observed collected information, talked to employees, and put together an invisible puzzle that only revealed itself at the right moment. The Atlantic Investment and Management Group had been under investigation for 4 months. Anonymous tips, inconsistent reports, contracts that didn't add up, and values that disappeared and reappeared in different spreadsheets. Everything pointed in the same direction, the financial department, commanded by a man named Richard Thorne. Richard was the kind of executive the company loved and feared at the same time. A graduate in economics with an MBA in international finance from Wharton, he had quickly climbed the rungs of the corporate ladder. At 42, he occupied a position that many dreamed of reaching. He had a large office with a privileged view, a secretary who attended to his every whim, an enviable salary, and the forced respect of almost everyone around him. But respect and fear do not always walk together by choice. Richard Thorne was known for his harshness, for his loud voice in meetings, and for his quick and often cruel decisions. He did not accept challenges. He did not listen to suggestions that were not his own, and he treated his subordinates like replaceable pieces on a board where only he knew the rules of the game. Mark had observed all of this during the weeks he had been there. He saw employees leave meeting rooms with red eyes, saw others resign without notice, and saw the absurd turnover in Richard's team. He also saw the contracts signed in a hurry, the tampered reports, and the values that simply vanished from the official records. Richard Thorne's story, however, did not begin there. He had grown up in an upper-middle-class neighborhood in Westchester, the son of a respected lawyer and a university professor. The family always had a name, always had influence. Richard learned from an early age that the world was divided between those who commanded and those who obeyed, and he was determined to always be on the side of those who commanded. His marriage to Pamela, a successful architect he had met at a graduation party, seemed perfect to those looking in from the outside. 2 children, a spacious house on the Upper East Side, international vacations every year. But inside that house, things were different. Pamela had learned to live with her husband's arrogance, with the shouting, and with the constant need he had to prove he was superior to everyone. She kept quiet, smiled at parties, and pretended everything was fine, because it was easier to pretend than to confront. Richard carried a void that not even all his professional success could fill. He needed to humiliate to feel big. He needed to belittle others to feel elevated, and the more power he accumulated, the crueler he became. That morning, Mark knew something important was about to happen. He had received a discreet message from his superior at the consultancy. The weekly results meeting would be the perfect moment for the final observation before closing the final report. He should be present, he should observe, and, if possible, provoke a situation that would definitively reveal Richard Thorne's character. The meeting room began to fill around 9 in the morning. Analysts, middle managers, assistants, everyone entered with that expression of those who already knew what awaited them. Richard had the habit of turning follow-up meetings into true public interrogations. He would choose a target, usually someone who had made a small mistake, and make a spectacle of it. Mark entered discreetly and sat at the back of the room, near the glass wall that faced the hallway. He carried a black briefcase with some documents, a pen, and a notepad. Nothing that would draw attention. Beside him sat Chloe Miller, a 26-year-old junior analyst whom Mark had met in the first few weeks. Chloe was intelligent, dedicated, and visibly frightened by Richard. She greeted him with a discreet nod and whispered, "Another Monday of terror." Mark just smiled slightly, like someone who perfectly understood what that meant. Richard Thorne entered the room exactly at 9:15, as he always did. He liked to arrive a few minutes after everyone was already seated. He liked to feel the eyes turning toward him, the immediate silence, the complete attention. He wore an impeccable grey suit, a red tie and shiny Italian shoes. His hair was perfectly combed back, his face clean-shaven, and a luxury watch sat on his left wrist. He was the image of the successful executive. "Good morning, everyone. I hope you brought good news, because I don't have the patience for excuses today." The phrase fell like a veiled threat. Some laughed nervously, others just lowered their heads. Richard walked to the head of the table, where the main chair was, and remained standing for a few moments, observing every face present. "Let's start with last week's numbers. I want to know who met their goals, and who is going to have to explain why they are still at this company." The meeting followed the expected script. Graphs were projected on the screen, spreadsheets were opened, and numbers were debated. Richard interrupted constantly, criticized openly, and asked questions that were impossible to answer on the spot. He loved putting people against the wall, seeing the discomfort in their eyes, the sweat on their foreheads. Mark watched everything attentively, making discreet notes. He noticed something interesting. Richard didn't just humiliate, he also diverted attention whenever someone mentioned numbers that didn't match. When a manager commented on an inconsistency in a contract closed the previous month, Richard quickly changed the subject, blaming another department for operational failures. As the meeting progressed, Mark felt his cell phone vibrate discreetly in his pocket. It was a message from his superior. "Confirm presence and wait for the right moment." He replied quickly with a simple, "Okay," and went back to paying attention. It was then that Richard began to talk about a report that had been delivered the previous Friday, a document that, according to him, was completely outside the required standards. He flipped through some printed pages with disdain and threw the paper on the table. Who was responsible for this piece of garbage? The silence in the room was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Richard repeated the question, now with a louder voice. "I'm asking who delivered this ridiculous report. Is someone going to answer? Or am I going to start firing you one by one until I find out?" It was at that moment that Mark realized what was happening. The report in question was precisely one he had prepared, intentionally, with small inconsistencies that only someone very attentive would notice. It was bait, and Richard had bitten. Chloe, beside Mark, whispered in a trembling voice, "I think it was the external team. Did you see who delivered that?" Mark didn't answer. He just continued observing Richard, who was now walking around the room like a predator looking for the right prey. And it was exactly at that instant that Richard Thorne's eyes met Mark Sterling's. There was something in that calm gaze, in that tranquil posture, that bothered the manager. He stopped walking and pointed directly at Mark. "You? What's your name again?" "Mark Sterling." The voice was firm, without a trace of fear. Richard narrowed his eyes, trying to remember where he had seen that face before. "You're new here, aren't you? A temp?" "That's right. I was hired to assist with the quarterly closing." Richard smiled. It was a dangerous smile, loaded with cruel satisfaction. He had found his target for the day. A temporary employee, someone without protection, without internal connections, without anyone to defend him. Perfect. "So, tell me something, Mark Sterling. Did you happen to have a part in the preparation of this disastrous report?" Mark knew that this was the moment. He could back down, He could lie, he could divert, but that wasn't what he was there to do. He looked directly into Richard's eyes and answered with the same calmness as always. Yes, I did. I was responsible for consolidating the data from the finance sector. The entire room seemed to freeze. Chloe's eyes widened in disbelief. Other employees exchanged quick glances, already anticipating the massacre that was about to happen. Richard smiled even more. It was exactly the answer he wanted to hear. He crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly, like someone about to give a public lesson. I see. So you're the genius who thought this trash was good enough to be presented in a board meeting. Mark did not look away. His expression remained neutral, almost indifferent. The data is correct. If there is any inconsistency, I would be happy to review it. Richard let out a loud, exaggerated laugh, seeking the complicity of those present. Some laughed along, nervously. Others remained silent, embarrassed. Review it with pleasure, did you hear that, everyone? He's going to review it with pleasure. Do you know what I think, Mark? I think you don't have the slightest idea of the quality standard we require here. I think you're just another person who came here to try and make some easy money and thinks they can deliver anything. The words were harsh, calculated to humiliate, but Mark remained impassive. Richard noticed that the expected reaction was not coming, and that irritated him even more. He approached the chair where Mark was sitting, imposing his physical presence, trying to intimidate him. Let me explain something to you, my friend. This is no place for amateurs. This is a serious company with high standards, and those who can't keep up have to leave. And by the look of it, you won't last very long. The atmosphere was tense, heavy. Mark felt all eyes on him, but he maintained his composure. He knew that this was only the beginning. And Richard Thorne, confident in his absolute power, still had no idea that this Monday would be completely different from all the others. The public humiliation of Mark continued for a few more minutes that felt endless to those watching. Richard Thorne was in his element, walking around the room with that posture of someone who knew no one would dare interrupt him. He pointed out imaginary errors in the report, invented technical flaws that didn't exist, and laughed at his own cruelty while the others just watched in embarrassed silence. Mark remained seated, showing no visible reaction. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, no shame, just a disconcerting calmness that began to irritate Richard more and more. It was as if he were talking to a wall, wasting his performance on an audience that didn't react the way he expected. Aren't you going to say anything? Aren't you going to defend yourself? Richard asked, leaning slightly toward Mark. There's nothing to defend. The numbers are correct. If you would like to review them calmly, I can provide all the sources. The answer was spoken without changing his tone of voice, without defiance, but also without submission. Richard felt something he rarely experienced, the sensation of losing control of the situation. He was used to seeing people tremble before him, seeing lowered eyes, desperate excuses. But Mark offered none of that. You know what? Richard said, straightening up and crossing his arms. I think you haven't understood how things work here yet. Let me be very clear. Your time at this company is over. You can pack your things and leave. You're fired. The silence that followed was absolute. Chloe, beside Mark, widened her eyes and gripped her pencil so hard it almost broke between her fingers. Other employees exchanged quick looks, some shaking their heads almost imperceptibly. Everyone knew this scene. They had seen it before. Richard loved firing people publicly, turning the act into a warning for the others. Obey or suffer the consequences. Mark, however, did not move. He continued sitting there with the same neutral expression as before. Richard waited a few seconds, expecting the typical reaction. An apology, a plea for a second chance, maybe even tears. But none of that happened. Didn't you hear what I said? You're fired. You can leave. Mark finally moved, but not to get up. He just slightly adjusted his tie and looked directly into Richard's eyes. I understood perfectly, but before I leave, I need to make a quick call if you'll allow me. The phrase provoked an immediate laugh from Richard, who looked around seeking the complicity of those present. Some laughed along, others just looked away. A call? Who do you want to call? Your lawyer? The union? You can call whoever you want, my friend. It won't change anything. The decision is made. Mark didn't answer. He simply took his cell phone from his jacket pocket, unlocked the screen, and dialed a number that was already saved. The call was answered almost immediately. Mark stood up and walked to a corner of the room near the window, where he spoke in a low voice, but still audible to those nearby. "Hello, it's me. I'm in the 23rd floor meeting room. I confirm that the situation has developed as predicted. You may proceed with the protocol." The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Mark hung up, put the phone away, and went back to his chair, sitting down again, as if nothing had happened. Richard, who had followed the scene with an expression of disdain, let out another laugh. "Protocol? How ridiculous. Do you think someone is coming to save you? You can wait sitting down, friend. Now get out of my office before I call security." Mark didn't move. He just crossed his hands on the table and kept his gaze fixed on Richard. There was something in that posture that began to bother not only the manager, but also some of those present. Chloe felt a shiver run down her spine. She had known Mark for a few weeks and had always found him different from the other temps, but she had never imagined he could have so much courage to face Richard like that. The meeting tried to continue, but the atmosphere had changed. Richard tried to regain control, talking about other subjects, demanding results from other people, but his voice sounded less secure than before. He looked discreetly at Mark from time to time, as if trying to decipher exactly what had happened on that call. Meanwhile, on another floor of the same building, the president's phone was ringing. Claire Anderson, the CEO of Atlantic Investment and Management Group, answered personally. She was a 58-year-old woman with black hair streaked with silver, an impeccable posture, and a reputation built over decades of hard work. Claire had taken over the presidency of the company 3 years ago after a brilliant career in corporate finance. She was respected, feared, and admired in equal measure. The call she had just received came from the forensic audit consultancy hired months ago. The voice on the other end was clear and objective. "Mrs. Anderson, the investigator on site has confirmed that the situation has developed as we expected. Mr. Thorne's behavior was recorded and witnessed by multiple people. We suggest we proceed with immediate removal." Claire closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She knew this moment would come, but that didn't make the decision any less heavy. Richard Thorne was, in a way, a problem she had inherited. When she took over the presidency, he was already there with ironclad contracts, political connections, and a protection network built over the years. Firing him without concrete proof would be too risky. Therefore, she had opted for the longer but safer path, a silent investigation. Proceed with the protocol, block his access immediately, and send the formal notification. I will go down personally in a few minutes. While Claire mentally organized the next steps, her mind went back a few months in time. She remembered perfectly the day she received the first anonymous tip about irregularities in the finance department. Initially, she hesitated. Richard had results. He had impressive numbers. He had a reputation for toughness that many considered necessary. But the tips kept coming. Employees resigning without explanation, contracts that made no sense, values that disappeared and reappeared in different places. It was then that she made the decision to hire the specialized consultancy. And that was how Mark Sterling entered the story. Back in the meeting room, Richard was trying to keep up appearances, but something inside him was beginning to stir. He noticed that some employees were looking at their cell phones with expressions of surprise. A human resources manager who was present stood up discreetly and left the room, holding her phone to her ear. "What is going on?" Richard asked, trying to sound firm, but with a hint of irritation in his voice. No one answered immediately. It was then that the landline in the meeting room rang. The shrill sound cut through the silence and made everyone look in the direction of the device. Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." The voice on the other end was formal, distant. "Mr. Thorne, this is the Human Resources Office. The CEO would like to speak with you immediately. Please come to her office now." Richard frowned. "I'm in an important meeting. I can't leave now." "Sir, it's urgent. She asked that you come immediately." There was something in the tone of that voice that made Richard feel a slight knot in his stomach. He tried to maintain his composure, hung up the phone, and looked at those present. "Continue without me. I'll be back in a few minutes." He left the room trying to look calm, but his steps were slightly faster than normal. As soon as the door closed behind him, the entire room seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Chloe turned to Mark with wide eyes. "What did you do?" Mark just smiled slightly, without revealing anything. He knew that in the next few hours, Everything would become clear, but for now silence was necessary. As Richard walked through the hallways toward the president's office, his mind was racing. He tried to understand what could have motivated that sudden summons. Had someone complained about him? Had an employee filed a formal grievance? He quickly dismissed those possibilities. After all, no one had the courage to face him. When he arrived at the president's anteroom, Claire's secretary received him with a serious expression. "You may go in." "She's waiting." Richard straightened his jacket and entered. Claire was sitting behind her large desk with a closed folder in front of her. She didn't smile. She didn't stand up. She just pointed to the chair in front of her. "Sit down, Richard." The tone was different. There was none of the usual cordiality. Richard felt a slight discomfort, but maintained his confident posture. "Good morning, Claire. You called me." "I did. I need to inform you about a delicate situation that directly involves your performance here at the company." Richard frowned, trying to look surprised. "My performance? I don't understand." Claire opened the folder slowly and took out some documents, placing them on the table in an organized manner. "In the last 4 months, we have received multiple tips about irregularities in the finance department, inconsistent contracts, values that don't match, questionable decisions. Everything pointed to your sector." Richard felt his blood run cold, but tried to maintain his composure. "Tips? What kind of tips? This is absurd." "So absurd that we hired a specialized consultancy to investigate. And during the last few weeks we had an investigator working internally, observing, collecting information, talking to employees." It was at that moment that Richard understood. Mark. The calm temp he had just publicly humiliated. The man who made that strange call. He felt the floor disappear from under his feet. "And just now, that investigator called me confirming that he personally witnessed your abusive behavior, your way of treating employees, and most importantly, he found enough evidence to justify a preventive suspension while we proceed with internal inquiries." Richard tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Claire continued, implacable. "Your access to the systems has been blocked. You are suspended as of this moment. The legal team is preparing all the necessary documentation. I suggest you cooperate." Richard Thorne's world, which minutes before seemed solid and unshakable, was beginning to crumble right before his eyes. The news spread through the company with the speed of a wildfire. Employees on every floor began exchanging discreet messages, surprised looks and whispers in the hallways. Richard Thorne, the feared and untouchable manager, had been suspended. People didn't know all the details exactly, but they knew enough to understand that something very serious had happened. In the 23rd floor meeting room, where it had all begun that morning, the mood was one of disbelief mixed with silent relief. Chloe Miller was still looking at Mark as if she were seeing a ghost. She couldn't completely process what she had just witnessed. "Did you know this the whole time?" she asked in a low voice, almost whispering, even though Richard was already out of the room. Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. He knew he couldn't reveal too many details, but he also understood that Chloe deserved at least a partial explanation. "I can't say much about it now, but yes, I wasn't here just as a temporary analyst. There was a greater purpose." Chloe shook her head slowly, still trying to take it in. She remembered all the interactions she had with Mark in the last few weeks. The conversations in the hallways, the coffee in the break room, the seemingly casual questions he asked about the company's functioning, the internal processes, the people. It all made sense now. He was observing, collecting information, putting together an invisible puzzle. "I always thought you were different from the other temps. You paid attention to things that no one else noticed, and you never seemed intimidated by Richard." Mark smiled slightly. "Intimidation only works when you let it work. Richard built an empire based on fear, but fear is an illusion that dissolves when someone decides not to believe in it anymore." The meeting was officially ended a few minutes later. The employees left the room still processing everything that had happened. Some were visibly relieved, others confused, and a few clearly worried about what that sudden change could mean for their own positions. Meanwhile, in another part of New York, specifically in a spacious house on the Upper East Side, Pamela Thorne was in her usual morning routine. She was drinking her coffee while reviewing some architectural projects on her tablet. Taking advantage of the hours when the children were at school and the house was silent, Pamela was an elegant woman of 40, with carefully treated blonde hair and an impeccable appearance she maintained with almost military discipline. Her marriage to Richard had always been complicated, but over the years she had learned to build a parallel life where her professional projects and her moments of peace compensated in a way for her husband's harshness. She knew about his temperament, his outbursts of anger, the constant need he had to prove himself superior, but she also knew that arguing or confronting him led nowhere. It was easier to accept, to divert, to pretend everything was fine. When the phone rang that morning, she saw it was Richard and answered without much expectation. He was probably calling to say he would be late or that he had some last-minute commitment, but what she heard on the other end of the line was completely different. "Pamela, I need you to come pick me up at the company. Now." His voice was strange, tense, without the usual confidence. Pamela frowned. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I can't explain over the phone. Just come pick me up. It's urgent." Before she could ask more questions, Richard hung up. Pamela stood still for a few seconds, looking at the phone in her hands, trying to understand what could have happened. Richard never asked to be picked up. He always had a driver, always had complete autonomy. Something was very wrong. She grabbed her bag, her car keys, and left in a hurry. During the entire drive to the corporate building on Park Avenue, her mind raced with possibilities. Had he fought with someone? Had there been an accident? Was he sick? Every red light seemed to last an eternity. When she finally arrived at the building, she found Richard waiting outside, away from the main entrance. He was standing there with an expression she had never seen before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration. It was something closer to contained despair. "Richard, what happened?" He didn't answer immediately. He just got into the car and waited for her to do the same. Only when they were on their way home, in the tense silence of Manhattan traffic, did he finally speak. "I've been suspended." Pamela almost stepped on the brakes in surprise. "Suspended? What do you mean suspended?" "They were investigating me for months. They put an investigator inside the company, disguised as a temporary employee, and today, when I was in a meeting, it all came to light." Pamela felt a knot form in her stomach. She didn't know exactly what Richard had done, but she knew her husband well enough to know he wasn't innocent. She had always pretended not to see, always looked away, always preferred the illusion of security to the inconvenient truth. And now, what's going to happen? "I don't know. The president said they're going to investigate everything. They blocked my access, suspended me preventively." "Pamela, this could end my career." For the first time in many years, Pamela saw genuine vulnerability in her husband's eyes, and instead of feeling compassion, she felt something different, a mixture of relief and exhaustion, as if a truth she had been avoiding for so long had finally been put on the table, impossible to ignore. "You always knew this could happen, didn't you?" Richard looked at her, surprised by the question. "What are you talking about? The way you treat people, the way you act. You think you can humiliate everyone, that you can do whatever you want without consequences. I always knew that one day this would come back to you." The words came out with a coldness that surprised even Pamela herself. Richard remained silent, processing what he had just heard. He had always assumed his wife was on his side, that she accepted everything without question. But at that moment, he realized he might never have really known the woman he shared his life with. Back at the company, Mark was meeting with Claire Anderson in her office. The president wanted to hear the investigator's full report personally before making the next decisions. "Mr. Sterling, first, I want to thank you for your discretion and professionalism throughout this process. I know it wasn't easy living in that environment for weeks." Mark nodded slightly. "It's part of the job, but I confess I have rarely seen such a clear case of systematic abuse of power. Richard Thorne didn't just commit financial irregularities, he created a culture of fear that contaminated the entire team." Claire sighed, flipping through the documents Mark had prepared over the weeks. "And now comes the hard part, dealing with the consequences. We have to investigate every contract he signed, review every decision he made, and at the same time try to rebuild the team's trust." Mark agreed. He knew his work was finished, but he also knew that for the company, that was just the beginning of a long process. It was at that moment that the office door opened and a woman entered. She was about 35 years old, with dark brown hair tied in a bun, intense green eyes and a firm posture. She wore an impeccable navy blue suit and carried a leather briefcase in her hands. Claire stood up immediately. "Ah, perfect. "Mark, this is Beatrice Adams, our legal director." "Beatrice, this is Mark Sterling, the investigator responsible for the Thorn case." The two greeted each other with a formal handshake, but when their eyes met, there was an almost imperceptible pause. Something passed between them, an instant connection that neither expected to feel at that professional moment. Beatrice was the first to look away, turning back to Claire. "I received the preliminary report. We need to act quickly to contain possible legal damage. Richard Thorn has strong connections and a history of well-drafted contracts. He won't accept this passively." Claire nodded, sitting back down. "I know. That's why I want you to coordinate the entire legal part of this process. Work directly with the audit people and make sure every step is properly documented." Beatrice agreed and looked at Mark again. "I'm going to need all the evidence you collected, organized chronologically and with all sources identified. Can we meet later today to align the details?" "Of course. My work officially ends tomorrow, but I'm available to collaborate in whatever is necessary." There was something in Mark's voice that made Beatrice feel a slight quickening of her heart. She scolded herself mentally. That was neither the time nor the place for those kinds of thoughts. But it was impossible to deny that there was something about that man that intrigued her. "Great, then let's meet at 3 in the afternoon in the 10th floor meeting room." After Beatrice left, Claire looked at Mark with a discreet smile. "She's one of the best we have. If anyone can ensure this process is conducted properly, it's her." Mark just nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. There was something about Beatrice Adams that reminded him of someone from the past, a memory he had tucked away a long time ago, and that now, unexpectedly, was coming to the surface. Meanwhile, Chloe Miller was in the break room, having a coffee and talking with other colleagues about everything that had happened. The news of Richard's suspension had already spread completely, and the reactions were varied. "I always knew he was going to fall one day. No one can be that cruel for so long without suffering consequences," said Julian, a senior analyst who had been with the company for over 10 years. "But what now? Who's going to take over the finance department?" asked Rachel, a project manager who always had a tense relationship with Richard. Chloe remained silent, just listening. Her mind was still processing everything. She thought of all the times she had felt small before Richard, all the nights she had arrived home emotionally exhausted, all the tears hidden in the company bathroom. And now, knowing that someone was watching, collecting evidence, working silently to change that situation, made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe, she thought, things really could change. Maybe that was the beginning of something different, of an environment where people were treated with dignity, where fear was not the main currency. And as the afternoon advanced over New York, with the chaotic traffic, the cloudy sky, and the busy life of the city following its course, many stories were intertwining at that moment. Richard Thorn faced the collapse of everything he had built. Pamela silently questioned the choices she had made over the years. Mark prepared to finish his work and move on. And Beatrice, without knowing exactly why, felt that this case would not be just another file on her desk. The meeting between Mark and Beatrice was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon, but Beatrice arrived 10 minutes early. She wasn't usually anxious, but there was something about this meeting that made her restless. As she organized her documents in the 10th floor meeting room, she tried to understand why she was feeling that way. It was just another professional case, another internal investigation, another corporate problem to be solved. But there was something different there, something she couldn't name. Mark arrived punctually at 3 o'clock. He brought an organized folder with all the reports, documented evidence, and a detailed chronology of the irregularities he had identified. When he entered the room and saw Beatrice already waiting, he felt that same sensation from the meeting in the morning. It was as if he already knew her from somewhere, as if there were a strange familiarity between them. "Good afternoon," Beatrice said, extending her hand formally. "Good afternoon. I brought everything you asked for. It's all organized by date and type of irregularity." They sat across from each other, separated only by the glass table of the meeting room. For a few minutes, the conversation was strictly professional. Mark explained each document, each piece of evidence, each testimony he had collected. Beatrice made meticulous notes, questioned details, and requested clarifications. She was extremely competent, focused, and objective, but there were moments when their eyes met, and the conversation was lost for a few seconds. Brief pauses, then a clear, "Yes, I understand. Thank you for your time." Beatrice nodded, her eyes wide. "Of course. I'll be in touch." silences that lasted a little longer than they should, until Beatrice, unable to contain herself, asked a question that had nothing to do with the case. "Have you always worked in corporate investigations?" Mark paused, slightly surprised by the change of subject. "Not always. I started my career in traditional auditing, but over time I realized I had more of an affinity for this kind of work. It's more challenging, more complex. And you? Have you always been in the legal field?" Beatrice smiled for the first time since they had started the meeting. "Always. Since college, I knew I wanted to work in corporate law. My father was a lawyer, so I grew up hearing conversations about lawsuits, contracts, legal disputes. It was natural for me to follow that path." There was something in the way she spoke about her father that made Mark notice a slight melancholy in her voice. He didn't ask, but he was curious. Beatrice, for her part, noticed that he had noticed and decided to explain. "My father passed away 3 years ago. Heart complications. He was always my biggest supporter, my mentor. Sometimes I miss his advice, especially in difficult cases like this. I'm sorry. Losing someone who guides us is always hard." "Thank you. And you? Do you have family here in the city?" Mark hesitated for a moment. He rarely spoke about his personal life, especially during investigation work. But there was something about Beatrice that made him want to make an exception. "I have my mother who lives in Princeton. I visit her whenever I can. My father left us when I was a child, so it's always just been the two of us. She's a retired teacher, a strong woman who taught me everything about perseverance." The conversation flowed naturally, as if they were old friends reuniting after a long time. Without realizing it, they had moved completely away from the professional subject, until Beatrice looked at the clock and realized it was almost 5 in the afternoon. "My God, 2 hours have passed. I'm sorry, I got carried away by the conversation." Mark smiled. "No need to apologize. It was good to be able to talk about other things besides work." There was a moment of comfortable silence between them. Beatrice organized the documents, preparing to leave, but stopped before standing up. "Can I ask you a personal question?" "Sure. Have you ever been married?" The question caught Mark off guard. He took a deep breath before answering. "I was. For 6 years. We separated 4 years ago. It was a difficult but necessary decision. We loved each other, but we wanted different things from life. She wanted stability, routine, predictability. And I couldn't give up this kind of work which, by nature, is unstable and unpredictable." Beatrice nodded, understanding. "I understand. I've also been married. 3 years. We ended it 2 years ago. He couldn't deal with my professional ambitions, with the hours I dedicated to work. He said I loved my career more than him, and maybe he was right." There was a raw honesty in that confession that made Mark feel an even stronger connection with her. They had lived different stories, but they carried similar wounds. "You know, sometimes I wonder if it's worth making so many sacrifices for a career," Beatrice said with a thoughtful tone. "We work so hard, build so much, but at the end of the day, we go back to an empty house." Mark agreed in silence. He knew exactly what that was like. Maybe it's not about choosing between one thing and another. Maybe it's about finding someone who understands our choices and is willing to walk alongside us. Beatrice looked directly into his eyes, and at that moment, something changed. It was no longer just a professional connection or a casual conversation. It was something deeper, more real. But neither of them was ready to name it yet. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Richard Thorne was locked in his home office, trying to process everything that was happening. He had spent the entire afternoon making calls, contacting lawyers, trying to understand exactly what accusations weighed against him. The answers he received were not encouraging. Pamela entered the office without knocking. She brought a cup of coffee in her hands, but her expression was not one of solidarity. "The boys get home from school in an hour. They're going to ask why you're home. What am I going to say?" Richard didn't even look at her. "Tell them I'm working from home today." "Richard, we can't keep pretending everything is fine. The boys aren't idiots. They feel when something is wrong. And what do you want me to do? Should I sit with them and explain that I was suspended from the company because I was being investigated? Should I tell them that everything I built might crumble?" Pamela placed the cup of coffee on the desk with more force than she intended, Maybe that's exactly what you should do. Maybe it's time to stop pretending you're invincible and start facing reality. Richard finally looked at his wife, and for the first time in a long time, he really saw her. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the accumulated hurt, the contained frustration. And he realized that it wasn't just his career that was crumbling, it was everything. "You never truly supported me, did you?" he said with a tone of bitterness. Pamela laughed, but it was a humorless laugh. "Support? Richard, I spent years pretending not to see how you treated people. I pretended not to notice the shouting, the arrogance, the cruelty. I pretended because it was easier than confronting it. But truly support you? I never did that. Because to support someone, you need to believe in what that person is doing. And I never believed." The words fell like heavy stones on Richard. He tried to answer, but found no arguments. Pamela turned her back and left the office, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Back at the company, Chloe was finishing some reports when Mark passed through the hallway. She called him discreetly. "Mark, can I talk to you for a minute?" "Sure." They moved to a more private corner. Chloe seemed hesitant, as if she were gathering courage to say something important. "I just wanted to say thank you. I don't know if you realize it, but what you did today changed many lives in here. Not just mine, but many people who suffered in silence." Mark smiled slightly. "I just did my job, Chloe. The real changes will depend on you now, on having the courage to speak up, on not accepting what is unacceptable anymore. I know, and I promise I'm going to try. I'm going to try to be more courageous." There was a brief but sincere hug. Chloe went back to her desk and Mark continued on his way. He was about to leave the building when he received a message on his phone. It was from Beatrice. "I'm in the parking garage. Can we talk a bit more before you go?" Mark felt his heart quicken slightly. He typed a quick reply. "I'm on my way." When he arrived at the parking garage, he found Beatrice leaning against her car, an elegant black sedan. She seemed nervous but determined. "Sorry to keep you here. I know you must be tired, but I needed to tell you something." Mark approached, waiting. "I don't usually do this, mix personal life with professional, but since we met this morning, I can't stop thinking about you. And I know maybe it's crazy. I know we met only a few hours ago, but I felt something I haven't felt in a long time." Mark stood in silence for a few seconds, processing those words. Then, with a sincere smile, he replied, "I felt it too, and I don't think it's crazy. Sometimes you just know when something is real." Beatrice smiled, relieved. "So what do we do with this?" Mark took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I think we start slow. A coffee tomorrow, maybe? No documents, no cases, no company, just the two of us. I'd love that." They looked at each other for a few more moments, with genuine smiles on their faces. And there, in the parking garage of a corporate building in Manhattan, as the day came to an end and the city prepared for another busy night, two people who carried wounds from the past found the possibility of a new beginning. Meanwhile, Richard Thorne looked out the window of his office, watching the sun set over the city he always believed he had conquered. But now, alone in that large and empty house, he was beginning to understand that conquests built on fear and the humiliation of others were, in truth, sandcastles destined to crumble at the first tide. The days that followed Richard Thorne's suspension were intense for everyone involved. The company entered a deep restructuring process, with external audits being conducted, employees being heard, and documents being thoroughly reviewed. The atmosphere in the office had completely changed. There was a lightness in the air, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. Chloe Miller was one of the first to be called to give her statement. She entered the meeting room with her hands trembling slightly, but she left with a sense of relief she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, someone had really listened to her complaints, taken her concerns seriously, and validated her experiences. Other employees followed the same path. Stories of public humiliation, of arbitrary decisions, of a toxic environment that undermined everyone's mental health began to emerge. The more people spoke, the clearer it became that the problem was not just Richard Thorne. It was an entire system that had allowed that behavior to flourish for so long. Claire Anderson called a general meeting with all the employees of the finance department. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the fateful episode that had changed everything. The room was packed, with people standing at the sides, all anxiously waiting to hear what the president had to say. "Good morning, everyone," Claire began, her voice firm but compassionate. I know the last week has been turbulent for all of us. Many changes happened quickly, and I know that generates insecurity. That's why I wanted to gather you all to speak with transparency about what is happening and about the next steps." The room remained in absolute silence. Claire continued, "Mr. Richard Thorne's suspension was not a decision made hastily. For months we received tips, analyzed evidence, and conducted a serious and professional investigation. What we discovered was unacceptable. Not just financial irregularities, but a systematic pattern of abuse of power, intimidation, and disrespect." Some people in the room nodded discreetly. Others remained tense, still processing everything. "And I want to make something very clear. This will never happen again in this company. No position, no matter how high, justifies the inhumane treatment of those who work with us. We are going to implement new policies, more effective reporting channels, and most importantly, a culture where respect is non-negotiable." When Claire finished speaking, there was a moment of silence before someone started clapping. Slowly, others joined in until the whole room was applauding. It wasn't a rehearsed or forced ovation. It was a genuine acknowledgement that something important was changing. Meanwhile, Mark and Beatrice had met for the coffee they had arranged. They chose a cozy cafe in Chelsea, away from the corporate world, where they could talk without interruptions or curious eyes. Sitting at a table near the window, with the soft morning light coming through the glass, they talked about everything except work. Beatrice talked about her passion for photography, a hobby she cultivated in her rare free moments. Mark told her about his fascination with American history and how he loved visiting museums whenever he had the chance. "You know, I was thinking," Beatrice said, distractedly stirring her coffee cup, "about what you said in the parking garage, that sometimes you just know when something is real." Mark smiled. "And do you agree?" "I think so. My whole life has been guided by logic, by rational decisions, by careful analysis. But with you, I feel that for the first time, I'm allowing my heart to take the lead." Mark reached his hand across the table, lightly touching her fingers. "It doesn't have to be one thing or the other. It can be both. The heart and reason can walk together." Beatrice intertwined her fingers with his, feeling a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. They stayed like that for a few moments, just enjoying each other's presence, without haste, without pressure. It was then that Beatrice's phone rang. She looked at the screen and sighed. "It's from the office. I need to take this." Mark nodded, understanding. Beatrice answered the call and her expression changed gradually. She became serious, concerned. "I see. I'm going there now. Thank you for letting me know." She hung up and looked at Mark. "Richard Thorne just sent an open letter to all the company's employees. He's defending himself, saying he's the victim of a conspiracy, that he's being unfairly persecuted. Things are going to get ugly." Mark frowned. "He has that right, of course, but I hope the evidence speaks for itself." Beatrice agreed, but there was an evident concern in her eyes. "I have to go. I'm sorry for cutting our meeting short." "No need to apologize. Go do what you need to do, and we'll talk later." They said goodbye with a long hug, and Beatrice left in a hurry. Mark stayed in the cafe for a few more minutes, thinking about everything that was happening. He knew that cases like this rarely ended quietly. There was always resistance. There were always those who tried to reverse the situation. In the house on the Upper East Side, Richard was in his office, surrounded by papers, notes, and a computer, open with multiple browser tabs. He had spent the last few days studying every detail of the case, looking for loopholes, trying to build a defense. The letter he had sent was only the first move in a larger strategy. Pamela entered the office without asking permission. She brought an expression of disapproval that Richard already knew well. "Do you really think this is going to work? Sending a letter dramatizing, playing the victim?" Richard didn't take his eyes off the computer. "I'm not playing the victim. I'm defending myself. I have that right." "You have the right to defend yourself, yes, but not to lie, not to distort the truth." Richard finally looked at her, irritated. "Are you on my side or not, Pamela?" She crossed her arms. "I'm on the side of the truth. And the truth is that you built a career treating people with contempt. The truth is that you always thought you were above everyone. And now you're paying for it." Richard stood up from his chair, agitated. "So what do you want? That I just accept everything quietly? That I let my career be destroyed without reacting?" Pamela took a few steps toward him, with a softer but still firm expression. I want you to stop fighting the inevitable and start fighting for something that's actually worth it. What do you mean by that? This family, your children, us. Richard, you're so focused on saving your professional reputation that you're losing sight of everything else. The boys are confused, scared. They don't understand what's happening. And I don't know what to do anymore either. Richard felt something break inside him. For the first time, he realized the real impact of his actions, not just on the company, not just on the employees, but on the people he should love and protect above all. I don't know how to fix this, Pamela. I don't know how to be different from who I've always been. She approached, and to his surprise, touched his face tenderly. Maybe it's time to learn, maybe this crisis is an opportunity, a chance to become the person you always should have been. That night, Mark was in his apartment, a simple but cozy unit in the West Village, when he received a call from Beatrice. She sounded tired, but there was something in her voice that indicated urgency. I need to tell you something. The investigations have advanced more than we expected. We found evidence of financial misappropriation much larger than we imagined. Richard wasn't just abusing his authority, he was also diverting company resources into personal accounts. Mark stood in silence for a few seconds, processing the information. That completely changes the scenario of the case. Exactly. It's no longer just a matter of inappropriate behavior. Now we're talking about possible embezzlement. The board is deciding whether to refer the case to the proper authorities. And do you think they should? Beatrice sighed. Professionally, there's no doubt. The evidence is there. But personally, I keep thinking about his family, about the children who are going to have to deal with this. Mark understood the dilemma. Sometimes doing what's right hurts, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be done. The consequences of our acts catch up with us sooner or later. And maybe, in the end, this is necessary for Richard to truly understand the gravity of what he did. You always know what to say, Beatrice said with a smile that Mark could feel even without seeing her. They're just words. The hard part is for you, who's going to have to conduct all this in a legal and ethical way. I know, but it helps me to know you're there. They talked for a few more minutes before saying goodbye. When Mark hung up, he walked to the window of his apartment and looked at the illuminated city. New York never slept. There was always movement, always life pulsing in the streets, in the buildings, in the people. And somewhere in this immense city, other stories were also being written. Stories of people facing their own crises, their own dilemmas, their own transformations. Richard Thorne was just beginning to understand the true meaning of his choices. Pamela was rediscovering her own strength. Chloe and so many other employees were learning to use their voices again. And Mark, who had always been an observer of other people's stories, now saw himself as the protagonist of his own narrative. A narrative that included not just investigations and corporate cases, but also the possibility of love, of connection, of new beginnings. The next morning, Richard received an official notification. The company had decided to refer the case for external investigation, including possible legal implications for the discovered financial diversions. He read the document with trembling hands, feeling the weight of every word, every accusation, every piece of evidence presented. And for the first time in his life, Richard Thorne saw himself completely without a way out. There were no more cards to play, no more maneuvers to make. It was the end of a cycle, the collapse of an empire built on fragile foundations. But maybe, just maybe, it could also be the beginning of something new, something more true, more human, more real. It remained to be seen if he would have the courage to walk that path. 3 months had passed since that Monday that changed so many lives. Autumn was beginning to show signs in New York, with cooler afternoons and a sky that alternated between grey and clear blue. The Atlantic Investment and Management Group had undergone deep transformations, not just structural, but essentially cultural. Claire Anderson had implemented a complete restructuring program for the finance department. A new director was hired, someone with an impeccable reputation and a proven track record of humanized leadership. Anonymous reporting channels were established, training on a healthy work environment was conducted, and most importantly, a new culture was beginning to flourish. A culture where professional excellence did not need to be accompanied by cruelty. Chloe Miller had been promoted, not because of favoritism, or because she had been a witness in the Richard Thorne case, but because of genuine merit. Her years of dedicated work, her technical skills, and her resilience were finally being recognized. She now led a small team, and made sure to treat them with the respect she always wished she had received. Every morning when she arrived at the office, she felt a deep gratitude for being part of that change. Beatrice Adams had become a central figure in the company's transformation process. In addition to conducting all legal matters related to the Richard case, she had also been invited to participate in an ethics committee created by the presidency. Her job was to ensure that the mistakes of the past were not repeated, and she took that responsibility very seriously. But there was another change in Beatrice's life, a change that had nothing to do with positions or professional responsibilities. She was in love, and for the first time in many years she allowed herself to feel it fully, without reservations, without fear. Mark and Beatrice had become inseparable. They met whenever possible, discovered new restaurants together, walked through the city's parks, and talked for hours about everything and nothing. What had begun as an unexpected connection in the middle of a corporate case had turned into something deep, true, and transformative for both. On that Saturday afternoon, they were in Central Park, walking hand in hand through the wooded paths. The sun filtered through the leaves of the trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground. "Have you ever thought about how all this happened?" Beatrice asked, stopping near the lake. "If you hadn't been assigned to that investigation, if Richard hadn't tried to humiliate you in that meeting, if I hadn't been called to handle the legal case, we probably never would have met." Mark smiled, hugging her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "I prefer to believe that some things were simply destined to happen, maybe not in the way they did, but in some way. We would have found each other one way or another." Beatrice turned to face him, her eyes shining with emotion. "Do you really believe that?" "I do. And I thank every day for having found you." They kissed there, in the middle of the park full of life, of families walking, children playing, couples like them rediscovering what it meant to be truly happy. Meanwhile, in a smaller house in Brooklyn, very different from the mansion on the Upper East Side, Richard Thorne was sitting on the porch, watching the movement of the street. He had lost a lot in the last few months. His job, his reputation, much of the wealth he had accumulated. The investigations had confirmed the financial diversions, and he had reached an agreement with the company. He would return the diverted amounts and would not face formal charges, provided he never worked in the financial market again. But the greatest loss had not been material. He had lost the trust of his children, almost lost his marriage, and perhaps most importantly, he had lost the image he had of himself. The person he believed he was, the successful and powerful executive, had revealed himself to be a fragile illusion sustained by fear and arrogance. Pamela came out to the porch bringing 2 cups of tea. She sat down beside her husband in silence, offering one of the cups. They stayed like that for a few minutes, just watching the world go by. "The boys asked if you're going to their game tomorrow," Pamela said, breaking the silence. Richard nodded. "I am. I wouldn't miss it." They were beginning to rebuild, brick by brick, that which had been broken. It wasn't easy. There were days when Richard caught himself wanting to go back, to being who he was before, wanting to blame others, wanting to run away from responsibility. But then he looked at Pamela, at his children, and remembered why that was important. He had started therapy 2 weeks after the suspension. At first he was resistant, thinking it was a waste of time, but gradually the sessions revealed layers of himself he had never explored. The need for control came from a deep fear of not being good enough. The arrogance was armor to hide old insecurities, and the cruelty was just a distorted way of trying to prove his worth. Understanding all this didn't erase what he had done, didn't undo the harm he had caused, but it was a start, a first step toward becoming someone better. "You know, Pamela," Richard said, still looking at the street, "I spent my whole life trying to be important, trying to be the best, the most powerful, the most feared, and in the end, I realized none of that really mattered. What matters is right here." Pamela took his hand and squeezed it lightly. "I know, and I'm glad you finally realized it." That same night, Mark was in his apartment, preparing dinner for Beatrice. He wasn't a great cook, but he had learned to make a few recipes that she loved. The table was set with simplicity, candles lit, and a bottle of wine waiting. When Beatrice arrived, she hugged Mark for a long time before even taking off her jacket. "I needed this. It was an intense week." Mark kissed her face tenderly. "Then today is just about us. No work, no cases, no worries." They had dinner talking about future plans. Beatrice talked about a trip she was thinking of taking on her next vacation. Mark talked about a personal project he was developing, a book about his experiences in corporate investigations. Not a technical report, but something deeper, exploring the human side behind the cases. After dinner, they settled on the sofa, with a cup of tea each, just enjoying each other's company. "Do you know what I was thinking today?" Beatrice said, resting her head on Mark's shoulder. "About how a single moment can change everything. That meeting, that humiliation Richard tried to inflict on you, ended up being the catalyst for so many changes. For the company, for the people who worked there, for himself, for us." Mark reflected for a few moments before answering. "I think moments don't change things by themselves. They just reveal what was already there, waiting to emerge. The company already had problems. The people were already suffering. Richard was already on the path of self-destruction. The moment just accelerated the inevitable. And us? Were we already on the path to finding each other?" Mark smiled. "Maybe. Or maybe we created this path together, choice by choice, moment by moment." Beatrice pulled back slightly to look into his eyes. "I love you. You know that, right?" It was the first time she had said those words. Mark felt his heart quicken, a deep emotion taking over his chest. "I love you too, more than I imagined possible." They kissed there, sealing not just that moment, but also the promise of a future built together. A future where the past was not forgotten but integrated, transformed into learning and growth. At the company the following Monday, Claire called a special meeting. She wanted to officially mark the end of the restructuring process and celebrate the achievements. The room was packed with employees from all departments present. "I want to thank each of you for your patience, your resilience, and your courage during these months of change," Claire began. "I know it wasn't easy. Change never is. But you proved that it is possible to transform a culture. It is possible to build an environment where excellence and humanity walk together." She paused, looking at each face present. "The case that brought us here was painful. It revealed deep flaws in our systems, in our culture, in our way of leading. But it also gave us a rare opportunity, the chance to start over the right way. And that is what we are doing." There was sincere applause in the room. Chloe, who was sitting among her new teammates, felt tears of gratitude in her eyes. She remembered how she felt 3 months ago, the constant fear, the sense of helplessness, and now, looking around, she saw faces that expressed hope, confidence, renewal. After the meeting, Chloe found Mark in the hallways. He had returned to the company that day just for a final wrap-up meeting of the case with Claire and Beatrice. "Mark!" Chloe called out, waving. "Chloe, how are you?" They hugged like old friends. "I'm good. Very good, actually. I got promoted, you know." Mark smiled genuinely. "I heard, and I couldn't be happier. You deserve it. Thank you. And thank you for everything. You changed my life. You changed the lives of many people here." Mark shook his head. "I just did my job. The ones who changed things were you, who had the courage to speak up, to trust, to believe that something better was possible." Chloe smiled, her eyes welling up. "Even so, thank you." When Mark left the company that day, he stopped for a moment on the sidewalk, looking at the glass building reflecting the blue New York sky. He thought of all the stories that place held, of all the lives that intersected there daily, and he felt a deep gratitude for having been part of that transformation. His phone vibrated with a message from Beatrice. "Dinner at my place tonight? I promise I'll cook something special." Mark smiled and replied, "I'll be there. I love you." As he walked down Park Avenue amidst the constant movement of the city, Mark reflected on what he had learned from that case. That power without empathy is just tyranny in disguise. That the choices we make echo far beyond what we can see. That real transformation begins when we have the courage to face our own shadows, and that sometimes from chaos and pain, truly beautiful things can be born. Richard Thorne never returned to the financial market, but he found purpose in other ways. He began working as a volunteer in an organization that helped low-income youth prepare for the job market. He taught what he knew about finance, but mostly he taught about the mistakes he had made, about how success without integrity is empty, about how power without responsibility is destructive. His children, in time, began to see a different father, not perfect, but present, not invincible, but human. And Pamela, slowly, began to reconnect with the man she had chosen years ago, before power and ambition turned him into someone unrecognizable. Life in Manhattan continued its frenetic pace, millions of stories happening simultaneously, each with its dramas, its joys, its transformations. And in the middle of all this, ordinary people made choices that changed not just their own lives, but also the lives of those around them. Mark and Beatrice continued building their story together. It wasn't a perfect story because real stories never are, but it was true, deep, and full of promise. They had found in each other not just romance, but partnership, complicity, and the courage to be vulnerable. And so, as the sun set over New York that autumn afternoon, tinging the sky with shades of orange and pink, each character in this story followed their path, some toward redemption, others toward new beginnings, all carrying the lessons learned from the events that had changed everything. The meeting that began as another episode of abuse of power had transformed into something much greater. It had become a milestone of transformation, a turning point where the unacceptable was finally confronted and the necessary was finally done. And the lesson remained clear. No matter how high someone climbs, no matter how much power they accumulate, in the end, we are all just human, subject to the consequences of our choices. And true strength is not in dominating others, but in having the courage to face oneself and choose to be better. Life moved forward as it always does, but now for those people whose lives had intersected on that fateful day, the path was different. It was a path of awareness, of growth, of transformation, and maybe, just maybe, of a future where humanity was not seen as a weakness, but as the greatest strength of all. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mark, Beatrice, Richard, and all the characters who crossed their paths touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of transformation, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you most in this narrative.